Start the session.
In today's lecture or session, we will discuss about the conservation of biodiversity ensuring long-term sustainability. In last two sessions, we have discussed about the concept of biodiversity, what is biodiversity, and what discussed about India as a mega biodiverse nation. We talked about the biodiversity hotspots. We talk about the various causes of the biodiversity loss, and also that how biodiversity loss is impacting the ecosystem services. So in today's session, we will talk about how to we can achieve the conservation of biodiversity. And so first we will discuss about what is conservation, the concept of conservation. So conservation is basically the care and protection of natural resources, not only for the present generation, but also for the future generation. And this include conservation of wildlife, air, water, forest, that all is included under the umbrella term of conservation. If we talk about the difference between the two concepts, one definition you might have heard that is the preservation, and second is conservation. So preservation basically means that protecting the nature all throughout from the human use. So no human interference shall be allowed in that particular area, or no human activities allowed. In conservation, basically, the sustainable use of the natural resources by humans is basically allowed. That means uh, the use of biodiversity or use of the natural resources, wildlife, at a limited scale, so that it doesn't impact the sustainability. So basically, there is a difference between the two terms, preservation and conservation, which should be analyzed, that the two terms are quite different from each other. Next, we move on towards what are the methods of biodiversity conservation. So basically, broadly, we divide them in two categories, that is in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. In situ means, as from the name, it is very clear, in means inside the natural habitat. So in situ conservation basically focuses on the conservation of biodiversity within the natural landscape or natural habitat in which it thrives or it is part of. And ex situ means outside the natural habitat of the biodiversity. So conservation of the biodiversity outside its natural habitat is referred to as the ex situ methods of biodiversity conservation. In situ method, we have protected area network, which is also known as PAN or PAN. In that, we have the sacred groves, sacred lakes, biosphere reserves, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries. In ex situ conservation, we have basically botanical gardens, zoological parks, aquariums, arboretia, seed banks, gene banks, cryopreservation techniques. Then we have the sacred plants and the home gardens. So they are all part and parcel of the ex situ methods of the conservation. If we talk about, let's discuss in detail what is in situ conservation, or what are the in situ methods of the conservation. So basically, in situ method of conservation, as discussed, they are basically focused on site conservation of the population and its genetic makeup. So within the natural surroundings where the plant and animal has evolved and is thriving, they are conserved in their natural surroundings only. So basically, all the endangered plants or animals, they are protected within their natural habitat, and they are given the extra protection from the invasive species and also from poaching activities which are threatening their survival. If we talk about the agrobiodiversity, in conservation of agrobiodiversity is also carried out in agroforestry conditions in unconventional farming, using unconventional farming practices. Similarly, in situ conservation basically involves protecting an area by declaring it as an national park, wildlife sanctuary, or the biosphere reserve. Then we have, give me a minute. Here is a total account of that number of protected area network, or PAN, how that functions in India, and number of national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and biosphere reserves, community reserves, conservation reserves, which are present in India. This is a brief account of that. This table basically depicts that, whereas you can see that in year 2000, the number of national parks in India were 89, which rose to 106 in 2021. So this is basically the latest figures which has been released by the government. In year 2000, the number of wildlife sanctuaries in India were 485, which rose to 564 in 2021. And the area also covered by these two has also rose from, while it was 1,88,006 sorry, 1,08,862 square kilometers in the year 2000, which rose to 1,22,509.32 square kilometer in 2021. Similarly, if we talk about the community reserves, and there were none in year 2000, which rose to 218 by the year 2021. So this is a brief gist of the number of protected areas which can be found in India. Next is the national park. What is the concept of the national park? So in the national park, it is an area which is reserved for conservation of the wildlife, for the betterment of the wildlife, and no human activity is basically permitted inside the national park. In India, we can see the first national park, also known as the Hales National Park, which later named as the Jim Corbett National Park, which is located now in Uttarakhand. So now if we talk about whole network of national parks, they have been established in India after the passing out of the Wildlife Conservation Act in the year 1972. If we talk about the national park, there are various zones which are demarcated in national park. There are two prominent zones. First is the core zone, then the buffer area or the buffer zone. In the core area, no human activity is basically allowed in the core area. And in the buffer region, there also no human activity is allowed, only some scientific research or ecotourism that is basically allowed in this area with the prior permission from the chief wildlife warden. So basically you have to obtain permission from the chief wildlife warden, then only you are permitted to carry out scientific research and ecotourism activities in the buffer zone of the area. So that means that highest degree of protection is provided to the wildlife in the national parks. Then we come to some of the important national parks which can be found here. As discussed, Jim Corbett National Park is the first national park which is established in India, and it is dedicated for the conservation of tiger. Along with that, elephants can also be found here with other wildlife such as leopards, your cheetal deer. Uh, these can be found in these national park. Second is the Kaziranga National Park, which is located in Assam, which is dedicated for the conservation of Indian one-horned rhinoceros. And along with that, one can also find here Asiatic buffalo, water buffalo. And this is also the last abode of one of the largest wild population of the Asiatic water buffalo. Along with that, we can find the elephants here. Similarly, Giri National Park, which is located in Gujarat, is dedicated for the conservation of Asiatic lion. Sundarban National Park is located in West Bengal. and it is dedicated for the conservation of the mangrove forest along with the tigers. Satpura National Park, Madhya Pradesh, is located in Madhya Pradesh. Sariska National Park is for the again for the conservation of tigers, located in Rajasthan. Kahana National Park, located in Madhya Pradesh, again for the conservation of tigers. Ranthambore National Park in Rajasthan, Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh, they are also dedicated for the conservation of the tigers. So similarly, you can see some of the examples which are present on the screen. And at present, 106 tiger national parks, they are present in India. So here's some of the interesting maps of the states through which you can locate the national parks and the wildlife sanctuaries which are present in Madhya Pradesh. So you can see the location of Bandhavgarh National Park, Fossil National Park, Kana National Park, Madhav National Park, Panna National Park, which are located in Madhya Pradesh. Then we have the Ratanpani Wildlife Sanctuary, National Chambal Wildlife Sanctuary, which is dedicated for the conservation of gharials, Noradehi Wildlife Sanctuary, Orcha Wildlife Sanctuary, Panchmadi Wildlife Sanctuary. So in this map basically depicts that. Similarly, for Uttarakhand, we can see here the wildlife sanctuaries and the national parks which are located in the state, which prominently depicts the location of the Corbett National Park, Gangotri National Park, Govind National Park, Nanda Devi National Park, Rajaji National Park, which is located in near Haridwar. And then we have the Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, Masuri Wildlife Sanctuary, Sona Nadi Wildlife Sanctuary. You can locate them on the map. Then we come to the another concept, which is of the wildlife sanctuary. So wildlife sanctuary is basically notified generally by the state government, and adequate protection to the wildlife is provided. Here also, the ecological, faunal, floral, geomorphological, natural, and geological significance areas, they are conserved through the process of wildlife sanctuaries also. But here also you can see the two zones, the core zones or the core area, and the buffer zone which is surrounding the core zone. There's difference between the wildlife sanctuaries and the national park is that whereas no human activity is allowed within the core zone of national park, but scientific research and your ecotourism is allowed in the national park through prior permission. But in wildlife sanctuary, if you observe, again in the core zone, no human activity is allowed, but in the buffer zone, limited human activities they are permitted, which include the harvesting of the fuel wood, collection of the NTFP, that is non-timber forest produce or non-timber forest products such as honey, tendu leaves, lac, along with the fuel wood, and limited grazing, which doesn't affect the your conservation goal. They are permitted in the buffer zone of the wildlife sanctuaries. So basic difference between the two is this. In India, we can observe 564 wildlife sanctuaries at present. So this is the list of some of the important wildlife sanctuaries which are located in the country. Wildlife Sanctuary located in Gujarat, which is dedicated for the conservation of the Indian wild ass. Dalma Wildlife Sanctuary present in Jharkhand. Biligari Rangaswamy Temple Wildlife Sanctuary located in Karnataka for the conservation of tiger. So you can observe here. I also like to mention that Asola Bharti Wildlife Sanctuary is the lone wildlife sanctuary which is present in Delhi, which is located in South Delhi, behind just the IGNOU campus. So we have the Asola Bharti Wildlife Sanctuary which is located in Delhi. So biosphere reserve, this is the third method of in situ conservation of biodiversity. And biosphere reserves, they are established under the UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere Program, or MAB program. So these biosphere reserves, they are dedicated for the conservation of the entire landscape. And they are very large track, and they cover quite large track. They might include some of the national parks and wildlife sanctuaries within their premises. So the program was initiated by UNESCO in 1971, and this basically focuses on the conservation of the entire life support system or the entire natural landscape. Okay. And a biosphere reserve, if we talk about the zones which are present in the biosphere reserve, it has three zones as compared to two zones which are present in your wildlife sanctuaries and national park. Here you can see three zones they are present here. First one is the core zone, as we can see in national parks and wildlife sanctuary, where no human activity is allowed. And second is the buffer zone, where limited activities such as research, educational activities, they are permitted here. And third one, which is unique to Biosphere Reserve, is the transition zone, which is the outermost part of the Biosphere Reserve. Here, sustainable agriculture, forestry, fishery, and small and medium scale industries, they are basically allowed here, which doesn't affect the conservation goal. So such limited human activities, they are permitted here, which are very much sustainable, and that doesn't affect the conservation goals. Such activities, they are basically allowed in this transition zone of the biosphere reserve. So where integrated management of land, water, and biodiversity is basically carried out. So here you can say this whole concept of sustainability can be observed, where limited human activities are also allowed. Along with that, you can say the uh, conservation is also achieved. Conservation of wildlife is also achieved, along with ensuring the limited sustainable human activities. Next, here we can find some of the 19 biosphere reserves which are present in our country. The first one was the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, which is present in the state of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and it also incorporates Bandipur National Park and Madhumalai Wildlife Sanctuary. So, as I told you that biosphere reserves, they are quite large in size, and they might include the wildlife sanctuaries and national parks within them. So some of the examples of biosphere reserves in India, they can be seen on the screen. The largest track among them is in the Kutch region of Gujarat, and it also conserves the cold deserts located in your Himachal Pradesh, Nanda Devi again present in Uttarakhand, Kanchenjunga for protection of the Himalayan region present in Sikkim. Then we have the Panna Biosphere Reserve located in Madhya Pradesh. Even marine areas of importance such as Gulf of Mannar Biosphere Reserve, which is present in Tamil Nadu, and Great Nicobar, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, they are present in your Andaman Nicobar Island region of the country. So these are also example of the biosphere reserves where marine areas are also protected within the ambits of the biosphere reserve. Then we come to the concept of the sacred groves, and sacred groves means the areas which have some religious significance and tradition associated with them. So they might be a small tract comprising of a few patches of greenery including some trees, or they might be of several acres, and they are dedicated to some gods and goddesses which are associated with them. And the trees there, they are worshipped, and many kinds of traditional beliefs are basically associated with the sacred groves, and that's why they are conserved, because of the religious significance which is associated with them. So at present in India, around 1 lakh to 1,50,000 sacred groves they are located in our country, which have quite a high religious significance. In different states, they are known by different names. For example, in Rajasthan, they are known by the name Orans. In Maharashtra, they are known as by the name Devans or Devans. So different states, they are known by the different names, and they have very high religious significance. And along with that, they provide conservation to the biodiversity, and also they dole out large number of ecosystem services. So sometimes you can observe that a whole track of forest, it has been cleared for the development activities or for deforestation purpose, but sometimes sacred groves, they are spared because of the religious beliefs which are associated with these sacred groves. However, because of erosion of the traditional belief system at present in our country, some of these sacred groves are now under severe anthropogenic threat. So here we can see through the map that what are how many sacred groves they are present in our country, and what is the distribution of these sacred groves in our country. So if I talk about the case of Delhi, the nearest sacred grove which is present in Delhi, it is located basically in NCR region, not exactly in Delhi. It is located in your Faridabad, Gurgaon region, and it is known as Mangarbani. So there is a traditional Gadaria Baba with which this sacred grove is associated, and no grazing activity is basically allowed in this Mangarbani sacred grove. So it is believed that if someone plucks the leaves or destroy the trees, he will be basically cursed. So that's why this area has remained intact from the various anthropogenic pressures, and still the tree species which are now extinct from Delhi and NCR region can be found in this Mangarbani sacred grove. So you can observe the salai trees which are now extinct from whole of the Arabli hill ranges or Delhi Ridge area, which can still be found here. Along with that, there are some Sterculia urens trees, which is also known as Kullu or Gom Katira tree, which the last tract of these trees can also be found in Mangarbani Sacred Grove, which is present in Gurgaon, Faridabad region. So biodiversity heritage sites, these are also can be found in our countries, and they are basically conserving the unique ecologically fragile ecosystems, whether they are terrestrial or inland water or marine areas with rich biodiversity. So they are demarcated on the basis of the following components. They have some richness of wildlife, whether they are domesticated or species, they are also can be conserved. These regions, they have high endemism and presence of rare and threatened species along with the keystone species. I'd like to discuss here what are the keystone species. Basically, keystone species are those species on which the entire ecosystems basically they are very much dependent. And if these species are removed, the whole ecosystem can crash. Keystone basically referred to as the concept, it comes from the church. The whole body or the arc of the church is basically based on a stone, which is known as the keystone. If this keystone is removed, the whole arc of the church, it will collapse. So similarly, also in your, if we talk about the ecosystem, some species of plants and animals, they play a very vital role in maintaining the ecosystem functions. And if these species they are removed, the whole ecosystem can suffer. For example, elephants are the keystone species, and similarly some of the ficus species, they can also be categorized as a keystone species, such as people, bargad or bird. They are also examples of the keystone species. In biodiversity heritage sites, species of evolutionary significance, wild and domestic ancestor cultivated species, they are also conserved in these biodiversity heritage sites. These are some of the examples of the biodiversity heritage sites. First one is the Nallur Tamarind Grove. This Nallur Tamarind Grove is present near the Bangalore city, and the taluk name is Devanhali, and the size of this Nellore Tamarind Grove is 54 acres. So it is believed to be the relic of Chola dynasty period, some 800 years ago, and it has has a population of nearly 300 trees. Much of them includes the tamarind trees. So the trees, they are quite old and they are gigantic in size, and they have the picturesque landscape which is associated with these Nellore tamarind grove. So these are the example of the BHS, the Biodiversity Heritage Site. Another example you can see on your screen is Hogrekan, which is located again in the state of Karnataka in the Chikmagalur district. And the size is larger as compared to the tamarind grove. The size is around 2,508.15 acres, and it is known for conserving the shola vegetation and the grasslands which are associated with it. So, and it also preserves the wildlife corridor between the Bhadra Wildlife Sanctuary and Yememe Dor Tiger Reserve. The these wildlife corridors, they play a very essential role for the migration of wildlife from one forest patch to another forest patch. Shola vegetation along with the unique Shola grasslands, they are conserved in Hogrekan BHS. Next, we come to what are the advantages of the in situ conservation. So advantages can be seen here that the organism, whether it is a plant or animal, it is conserved within its natural habitat. So the evolution progress or the process of evolution of the organism is not hampered. It continues in its natural way. Along with that, the species along with that particular species which need to be conserved, they are also conserved along with that particular species. For example, if we want to conserve the tiger, we have to conserve the whole landscape or habitat of the tiger. So and also we have to conserve the prey base of the tiger. So we can see the coexisting species or cohabiting species such as the deer, the axis deer or the cheetal deer, the sal trees, which are part and parcel of the tiger habitat. They are also given the full protection. So this is basically the advantage, major advantage of the in situ conservation. It is basically less expensive and easy to manage, and also the basically the rights of indigenous people, they are also conserved along with it. Even the natural and cultural heritage is also protected. So these are basically some of the advantages of the in situ conservation. But there are some of the disadvantages also associated with it. What are the disadvantages? Here we can see that if the habitat is severely fragmented because of the human activities, sometimes the survival of the species can not be ensured in the wild. The case we can see in the situation of the great the grasslands and the desert ecosystem, they are generally uh, believed they are the wastelands, and that's why many infrastructure projects such as setting up of the solar parks or they are approved in such areas, because these birds, they are very slow breeders. Their population is now restricted to only 150 individuals or less than that in the wild. So basically, the habitat of this bird is fragmented because of the setting up of various kinds of infrastructure, and that's why the survival of these birds, it is not 100% ensured in the wild environments. So that's why in situ conservation can be disadvantageous in such conditions. Second is that there might be some interspecific competition between the individuals. There might be territorial fights or diseases which can hamper the survival of organism in its natural habitat. The example, if we talk about the same situation applies for your various vulture species, Indian vulture species. Yesterday we talked about how the four vulture species present in India are decimated because of the diclofenac drug. So if the environment is not free from diclofenac, if the vultures, they are present, if you are trying to conserve them in the wild environment, but still diclofenac is present, the chances are high that these vultures, they feed on the diclofenac infested dead bodies of the cattle, and they might suffer from the gout and the kidney failure, and which can hamper the conservation process of these vultures. Similarly, there are some problems which are related to the poachers and eco-tourists. For example, some of the tourism activities, if they are carried out in unsustainable manner, carry with them the plastic waste, that can hamper your conservation goal. And sometimes the poachers can become a big threat for the wildlife. Even after so much protection, poaching might be possible, because in India, if you see, the forest department is understaffed in most of the locations, and there might not be possible to uh, give enhanced conservation or protection to these species. So in some of the situations, the in situ conservation can prove as disadvantageous. So now we move on towards the next method of the conservation of biodiversity, and that is ex-situ method of the conservation. So according to CBD, that is Convention on Biological Diversity, the ex-situ conservation basically include the conservation of plants, animals, and microorganisms outside of their natural habitat in some zoological parks, botanical gardens, or your gene banks. So basically, your wildlife is basically removed from the natural habitat and conserved in some other location. So such methods, they are included in ex situ methods of conservation. Here are some of the details of ex situ methods of the conservation, and we can see first example, animals, they are confined in basically the enclosures, and they are provided with mm, the suitable conditions in which they are thriving in their natural habitat. So basically, the conditions, they are imitated to match the natural habitat of that particular organism which need to be conserved. Some here, the zoo basically, uh, the animals, they are displayed to the public so that they can go there and learn about these wild animals or wild plants. So basically, what are the advantages which are linked to the zoo? There are several advantages that zoos in India, if we talk about, they some of the zoos, they have played a very great role in bringing back some of the endangered species. For example, Delhi Zoo has played a major role in so you can, if you go there, you can find that these deers, they are although endangered in the wild, but here they are thriving and their number is quite increasing. So in captive breeding programs, zoo have played a very critical role. Similarly, animals, they are secured from the threats which are present in their natural surroundings, and here they are provided with their adequate food, shelter, and also their mates, so that they don't feel social isolation. Next is the botanical gardens. If we talk about the botanical gardens, they are dedicated for the conservation of the plants, and also the genetic resources of the plants. So here you can find that plants can also be grown here under the greenhouses or conservatories. And within the premises of botanical gardens, you can find the herbariums, lecture rooms, laboratories, libraries, museum, and experimental or research plantings. So basically, botanical gardens, they play a major role in taxonomic collection of particular families of various cultivated crops, medicinal or aromatic or textile plants. So if we talk about a botanical garden, one thing I like to mention here is that examples include your Calcutta Botanical Garden, which is the oldest of the all botanical gardens. Have a botanical garden which is located in the Noida, and there are several botanical gardens which are located all across the country. Next is we talk about the captive breeding. So captive breeding program basically involves the breeding of the animals in the controlled environment, so that their population can be increased, and when their population becomes stable, then they can be re-released back into the wild or translocated back into the wild, so that wild population can be established of that particular species. So basically, some captive breeding programs, they are very much successful, and they helped in bringing back some of the wild species which are now extinct in their wild environments. For example, Przewalski horse or the Mongolian horse. Uh, this horse was extinct in the wild, and but because of the captive breeding program, the thriving population of this wild horse is now re-established again in Mongolia. Then we come to another type of ex situ conservation, and that is basically the gene banks. So in gene banks, the plant genetic material and animal genetic material, they are basically stored for a long period of time. This includes the seed banks, which are dedicated for the seeds, conservation of the seeds. Then we have the field gene banks, which is for the conservation of the live plants. Then we have in vitro gene banks for conservation of plant tissues and cells, and DNA banks, which include your conservation of embryos, zygotes, your eggs, your sperms, chromosomes, and DNA of various kinds of plants and animals. So these are some of the examples of the gene banks. And mind you, in gene banks, there is a technique known as the cryopreservation technique, which is mostly used in some of these cases, in which the embryos, the sperms, and the eggs of plants and animals, they are basically conserved in the liquid nitrogen and ultra low temperature of minus 193 degrees centigrade. Uh, so that is the gene banks also play a major role in long-term survival of the genetic material of plants and animals. So here are some of the advantages which are linked to the ex-situ conservation. They help in preventing the consequences of the habitat loss and species extinction, and they play a major role in translocation, reintroduction, and assisted migration and conservation strategies for critically endangered and endangered species. Some of the endangered species which are extinct in the wild, critically endangered species, and those species which are extinct in the wild or are on the verge of extinction, ex situ conservation methods have play a very pivotal role in bringing them back. For example, if we talk about the panda, the giant panda in China, the ex situ methods of conservation played a very important role in bringing, in stabilizing the population of the giant panda. And along with that, ex situ methods, they are very suitable in conducting research and scientific work, and also for the education purpose. If you want to teach a child about the various kinds of animals and plants, you might not take that child to the wild conditions. Obviously, we'll take them to the zoo or the botanical garden, so that the child might observe them, that how these animals they look like. And then so I want to say here that ex situ methods of conservation, they play a very important role basically in educational activities also, and also regarding the awareness among the common citizens or the public regarding conservation of the wild animals and the plant species. So, but there are some of the disadvantages which are also linked with the ex situ methods of the conservation, and here we can see some of the examples. First is that if you take the example of zoo, The zoo animals, they are kept in the enclosures, and their you can say the mental fitness of the animals, they might get affected. You might have observed that the animals, they are encircling inside the enclosures. So that is basically the indication that they are not feeling mentally fit in such conditions. They are stressed out or depressed in such conditions. Sometimes the animals might harm themselves only in such enclosed conditions. Similarly, you might have observed that the behavior of the public in the zoo, that is also not very appropriate. Sometimes in India, you can see the people, they are throwing stones at them and teasing the wild animals, which should not be allowed in such situation. Also, unhygienic conditions might be observed in the zoo. Next thing which we can say, that some of the animals, because they are raised in enclosed environment where they are artificially fed or bred, they might not show that resistance level in wild environments. If they are re-released back into the wild, they might not show the same resistance as they might expect it to be. So also there are high levels of inbreeding. So the genetic diversity of that wild animal is also affected. So inbreeding can lead to various kinds of genetic disorders and inbreeding depressions, which are basically linked to the ex-situ conservation method. Similarly, in case of plants, ecological shifts, small population size, genetic drifts, inbreeding, and in gardener-induced selection, they might negatively affect the population structure uh, if they are re-released back into the wild. So why the plants are also affected in case of ex situ conservation. Here we will talk about some of the projects which is launched by Government of India for conservation of various important wild species present in our country. So first example is your Project Tiger. So Project Tiger is basically established in the year 1973 and aims at protecting the tiger within its natural habitat. As we know that tiger is basically threatened because of increased demand of its skin along with the bones in international market. So there is a thriving international trade network for its wild body parts. So to prevent that and strengthen the protection of tiger, for checking the poaching activities, and also for repairing the relationship of the local people, and they feel involved in the tiger conservation. The Project Tiger has been initiated, and uh, for in the Project Tiger, a network of tiger reserves, they are established all over country. So the whole tiger habitat is basically conserved within the ambits of the Project Tiger. And at present, National Tiger Conservation Authority, or NTCA, is basically looking towards this project. It is basically managing this project in our country. So here is a list of legislation which are relevant to the biodiversity conservation in our country. So in that, majorly involved your Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which deals with the basically wildlife and its habitat, wild animals, birds, and there are various schedules in which these wildlife they are categorized. Schedule 1 animal, they are given the highest degree of protection. What are the wildlife crimes? They are also mentioned in this act. And what are the penalties which are associated with the wildlife crimes? They are also given in the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Then we have the Indian Forest Act and the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, which are dedicated for the conservation of forests in the country. Biological Diversity Act of 2002, it basically focuses on the conservation of biological diversity and its sustainable use, and equitable sharing of the biological resources is linked with the Biological Diversity Act of 2002. Then we come to various international agreements. and treaties which are dedicated for the conservation of the biodiversity. So here, the first one is CBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which came into the force by December 1993. 29 December 1993, and the main objectives on which it emphasizes are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of components of the biological diversity, and thirdly is the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising of the utilization of the genetic resources. So basically, what is what this objective is talking about is that we can see that various international companies or multinational companies, they basically are using various wild resources for bringing out new and new products such as cosmetic products or some kinds of medicines. But what happened in earlier times was that the tribal people which have discovered these plants and animals and their uses, and they are using them in their traditional ways since ancient times. Okay. But what these multinational companies they are doing, they are basically using them as a in product form, these plants and animals, and they are selling them in the international market, and they are earning uh, large number of benefits because of that. The traditional people or the tribal people which originally discovered the uses of these plants, they are not benefit out of this, but some other people which newly discovered these uses, and or they might have learned from the uses of these wild plants or animals from the tribal people, they are now basically earning dollars. So that's why for ensuring the equitable sharing of the biological resources, the Convention on Biological Diversity, it has been adopted. So basically, there are two kind of protocol which are associated with the CBD, or the Convention on Biological Diversity. The first one is the Cartagena Protocol. So Cartagena Protocol basically focuses on the handling, transportation of the living modified organisms, also known as LMOs. They are also referred to as the biotechnologically engineered organisms. Okay, so basically they might affect the human health and also impact the wildlife or the ecosystem. So that's why how to handle them so that they don't become nuisance for the human health and also for the ecosystem. The entire guidelines, they are laid down through the Cartagena Protocol, and it was adopted in year 2000 and entered into force by 2003. The next protocol which is associated with the CBD is the Nagoya Protocol, which is based on the benefit sharing. As I told earlier that multinational companies, they are earning great lot of profit arising from utilization of the genetic resources, but it is not reaching to those tribal people or the indigenous communities which are using these plants and animals through their traditional knowledge. So basically the Nagoya Protocol provides a transparent legal framework for effective implementation of the equitable sharing of benefits arising of the utilization of the genetic resources. And it has been adopted in Nagoya, which is located in your Japan, in year 2010, and it came into force by 2014. Third, we will talk about the Aichi biodiversity targets. And in the CBT, these Aichi biodiversity targets, they are also laid down. There are some 5 goals which are associated with the Aichi biodiversity target. And along with them, there are 19 targets which are laid down in this for achieving these goals. So some of the strategic goals can be seen on the screen. First one is to address the underlying cause of biodiversity laws and mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. That means that on the underground, what is the underlying cause of biodiversity loss should be recognized by government and society through adequate policy framework. It emphasizes on that. Second one is to the goal B. It basically focuses on reducing the direct pressures on biodiversity and also to promote sustainable use. Third one is to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystem species and genetic diversity. Fourth one is to enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. And fifth one is to enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. So these are some of the major, you can say, targets or the goals, sorry, the goals of Aichi biodiversity targets. Next, we come to the National Biodiversity Action Plan. And this is basically related to India. And as we are signatory to the Earth Summit in 1992, and also we are one of the signatory to Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. So we have to work on various national strategies and plans, programs for the conservation of the biodiversity. So basically, that resulted in a comprehensive action plan known as National Biodiversity Action Plan, in which the goals and the policy framework, they are basically laid down on how to conserve the biodiversity and also to promote the sustainable use of biological diversity. So this biodiversity action plan basically laid down the various uh, actions which need to be taken, or strategies which need to be formulated for conservation of biodiversity and also for its sustainable use. Next, we come to important coastal and marine areas. Uh, in India, I will talk about 106 coastal and marine sites. They have been recognized by Wildlife Institute of India, and they have been given adequate protection. Either they are covered under the national parks, wildlife sanctuary, biosphere reserve. That means they are upgraded as protected areas, and they are given adequate protection or conservation. So here you can see that 44 of them, they are identified in the East Coast, and 22 ICMBAs, they have been prioritized for immediate conservation. Because generally you can see the terrestrial areas, they are given much more importance as compared to the marine areas. But in India, the coastal and marine areas, they are also given equivalent protection, and they are also covered under the conservation ambits. Next, we come to another important international treaty known as the CITES. The full form of CITES is the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. This is basically an international agreement which has been basically conceptualized and came to the fore in the year 1973 in Washington, D.C. of the United States of America, and it entered into force by 1st July of 1975. And it basically aims at regulating the international trades of wild animal, plants, and also their body parts, so that they are not threatened and the survival of these species can be ensured. So most of the international trade prior to 1973, it was going on unregulated, unabated, to keep a check on the international trade, wildlife trade. This convention has been formulated, and various degree of protection has been provided to the plants and animals, and around 37,000 species, you can see on the screen, they have been given adequate protection according to the CITES agreement. Next, we come to the SDG. Okay, one thing more I missed here, that in CITES, there are 3 appendix Appendix 1, Appendix 2, Appendix 3, and within these appendix, this various species, they are grouped or classified under these appendix. So Appendix 1 basically that include those species which are on which the international trade is totally controlled, uh, and these species under Appendix 1, they are either endangered or critically endangered. So that's why their trade is strictly regulated. Okay. Then we come to SDGs and the biodiversity conservation. If we look at the SDG 15, that means the life on the land, or the diversity on the land, it basically is devoted towards the protection, restoration, and promotion, along with the sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably managing forest, combating desertification, and halting and reversing the land degradation. And also, it focuses on halting the biodiversity loss. The goal basically aims to take urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of the natural habitat and halting the loss of biodiversity by 2020 by protecting and preventing the extinction of threatened species. It also focuses again on fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of the genetic resources of plants and animals. And also it talks about urgent need to end the poaching and trafficking of the protected species of flora and fauna. So it also talks about that it also lays down on controlling the poaching and illegal wildlife trade. Next, we come to another international convention which is adopted in the year 1971, known as the RAMSAR Convention, which occurred in the Ramsar city of Iran. So RAMSAR Convention basically is an international treaty for conserving the wetlands and also the sustainable use of these sites so that they can be used for sustainably used for economic, cultural, scientific, and recreational purposes. So basically in India, if we talk about, there are 49 Ramsar sites which are found in our country. So Ramsar Convention basically focuses on the wetland conservation. So here is a list of and location of various 49 Ramsar sites which are located in our country. Through map, you can see them. Kyolodo National Park is one of them. Chilika Lake, Sambar Lake, Luktak Lake, Buller Lake, Harike Lake, which is again which is located in Punjab. Loktak Lake is located in Manipur. Bhoj wetland, which is present in your Madhya Pradesh. Okay, Pong Dam Lake, which is in Himachal Pradesh. So this is basically a list of the Ramsar protected sites which are present in our country. So here is a list of some of the references from which I referred to. And thank you so much. And now you can ask me any of your doubts and questions which you want to ask.